Hello, good evening, everyone, and welcome to this very special occasion of the Infosys Prize Lecture by Professor Nalini Anantharaman. And this is a joint event which is being hosted by ICTS TIFR, where you are, and the other center of TIFR in Bangalore for the Center for Applicable Mathematics at Yelahanka. So on behalf of TIFR, welcome to all of you. And I'll just say a few words about ICTS. Probably most of you know about ICTS. I know the cosmology participants I inflicted my usual introductory talk on ICTS on them today morning. But just in brief, ICTS is a center which is modeled on the KITP, MSRI, and Institute for Advanced Study, etc., but having elements of each of these institutions, but novel in its own way in that it has its own in-house research, as well as having programs and a lot of outreach. And in some ways, this is part of our outreach efforts. And this is, in fact, something in which we have partnered with the Infosys Science Foundation a lot. And last year, perhaps many of you were there at some of the events when we celebrated our 10th anniversary, and with also panel discussion and public lectures, etc. So I won't take much longer. I'll just invite Professor Prashant Srinivasan from TIFR CAM to introduce the speaker and tell us about her work.
Thank you. Good afternoon to everybody. Welcome to this Infosys Prize Lecture to be delivered by Professor Nalini Anantharaman. Nalini Anantharaman is a professor at the Institute for Advanced Study, University of Strasbourg, France, and is a leading expert in the area of analysis and partial differential equations. And she is the recipient of several major awards, including Salem Prize, the Herbrand Prize, Henry Poincaré Prize, and more recently the Infosys Prize. And she was a plenary speaker at the International Congress of Mathematicians held last year at Rio de Janeiro, and she will talk to us today on topics in quantum chaos. I welcome her to Bangalore and wish her a pleasant time in Bangalore.
Thank you. There's few small ceremonial things from the Infosys Foundation side, let me first read out a note from the Science Foundation, which says, Professor Anantharaman is the winner of the Infosys Prize 2018 in Mathematical Sciences, and this is her award lecture. The Infosys Prize is given to contemporary scientists and researchers below the age of 55 and consists of a gold medal, a citation by the jury, and a purse of USD 100,000. The Infosys Prize Lecture Series features talks by the laureates on their award-winning work and also by jurors on interesting work in their respective fields. These public talks were established by the Infosys Science Foundation to spread awareness on the truly awe-inspiring research and cutting-edge science being done by scientists, and to inspire young researchers and students to make their passion their profession. The ISF has a brief video message for Professor Anantharaman.
The jury for the 2018 Infosys Prize in Mathematics has unanimously selected Professor Nalini Anantharaman from the Institute of Advanced Research in Mathematics at the University of Strasbourg as the winner. Her work is an exploration of the deep connection between classical mechanics and quantum mechanics. Classical mechanics can be either an integrable system with many conserved quantities or an ergodic or even chaotic system. The question is how this affects properties of its quantum analog. Professor Anantharaman has introduced entropy into this study and has shown that in such a case the limiting distributions retain positive entropy and hence cannot be localized. She has since extended her methods to the setting of graphs. Her work has had a large impact. The jury is pleased to recognize her contributions and award her the Infosys Prize for 2018. Congratulations, Professor Anantharaman.
So congratulations, and I now welcome her to deliver her address.
Well, thank you very much for this introduction. So in my talk today, I want to describe several topics in quantum chaos, and mostly a question I've been working on, which is called quantum ergodicity. My talk will be divided into 3 parts. The first part will be devoted to the history of the problem, and in that part there will be a lot of motivations coming from physics. And little by little, the talk will look more like a mathematics talk. In the second part, I will talk about the question called quantum ergodicity, which is the one I've been working on for the last 10 years, let's say. And in the last part, I will talk about more recent work on a discrete model that is the case of large graphs. But let me start with some historical and physical motivations. So I will start the history a little more than 100 years ago, in in the 1910s, let's say. So that was the prehistory of quantum mechanics. And the goal at that time was to try to explain the spectrum of the atoms, so the fact that atoms can absorb or emit only certain frequencies of light, so only certain energies, and that these energy levels are discrete. And for that purpose, in 1913, Niels Bohr introduced his model of the hydrogen atom. The model is the following. You start with a classical description of the atom, so you imagine that the electron is a particle that gravitates around the nucleus submitted to Coulomb force. A completely classical description, but in addition, you add a rule, a kind of postulate. So you add the rule that the kinetic momentum is quantized. That means the kinetic momentum can only take a discrete set of values, that is to say, an integer multiple of the Planck constant. If you postulate that, this implies that the energy of the electron can also only take a discrete set of values, that the radius of the trajectory can only take a discrete set of values, and in this way, Bohr managed to explain in a very satisfactory way the experimental spectrum of the hydrogen atom. Of course, the next question was to find similar quantization rules for larger atoms, starting from the helium atoms, which has 2 electrons. And I will discuss a paper by Einstein of 1917, which is so it's a purely theoretical paper, a very mathematical paper. The goal is to give some abstract quantization rules for general Hamiltonian system with arbitrary number of degrees of freedom. So it's a very mathematical paper. He first discusses the previously introduced rules by Sommerfeld and Epstein. He corrects them, and then, so this is the original text in German, but let me show the English translation. So he gives some general abstract quantization rules, but very quickly he notices that the rules that he has found only make sense for a very particular class of systems that now we call completely integrable, because the rules that he has found is that the action variable must be integer multiple of the Planck constant, and these action coordinates are only well defined for completely integrable systems. And these systems, completely integrable one, he calls systems of type A, but then here in this short excerpt, he says that for systems of type B, the non-completely integrable ones, he doesn't know what the quantization rule should look like. And so this is this sentence here. One notices immediately that type B, so type B means non-integrable, excludes the quantum condition we formulated. On the other hand, classical statistical mechanics deals essentially only with type B, because only in this case, is the microcanonic ensemble of one system equivalent to the time ensemble. What is it that he means here? He's talking about what we now call systems having the ergodic property. Ergodicity is a property that I'm going to refer to again and again in my talk. It means that if you average your system over a large time, you get the same as the average, the microcanonic average, so the phase space average. So if you want, the question that Einstein is raising in this short remark here is how to describe the spectrum of a system that is ergodic. We now jump in time. We are now in 1925. During that time lapse, people tried very hard to find quantization conditions for the helium atom, but they failed. And after some time, Heisenberg, who was, I think, 25 at the time, he decided that hope was lost, that one had to find new rules for mechanics. And so he introduced some completely new rules for quantum mechanics. In these rules, in the Heisenberg rules, one of the main principles is that the physical quantities should be represented by mathematical objects that are matrices or operators. And he manages to explain the quantum effects by the fact that operators do not commute. And in particular, in the Heisenberg point of view, if you want to compute the spectrum of a physical system, you should first be able to build the operator corresponding to the total energy of the system, and then you should compute its eigenvalues. And this is the first time where the spectrum becomes synonymous to eigenvalues. In parallel to that, there was a apparently completely different theory being born, the one of De Broglie and Schrödinger. So De Broglie enunciated the principle of wave-particle duality. This means that in nature, all objects have a dual nature that sometimes should be apprehended as waves and sometimes as particles. For instance, we were used to considering light as being a wave, but in 1905, the photon was discovered. And in the opposite direction, we were used to thinking of the electron as a particle, but sometimes it should be apprehended as a wave. And what Schrödinger did is to find the equation that describes how these waves evolve in time. So in Schrödinger equation, if you want, this is the equation that replaces the Newton equation in quantum mechanics. So the unknown is the function psi, which is called the wave function. It's a function of time and of the position of the electron, and it evolves according to a linear equation. So you have that I times the Planck constant times d psi over dt is equal to a certain linear operator applied to psi. And for the electron gravitating around a nucleus, the operator is the Laplacian that corresponds to kinetic energy and the Coulomb potential that corresponds to the force. So we see that we have two apparently different point of views, but in both cases, to compute the spectrum, we must diagonalize an operator. So for Heisenberg, we must diagonalize some abstract operator H. And in Schrödinger's picture, we must diagonalize this Schrödinger operator. So this kind of Schrödinger operators are going to be the central object of my talk. In fact, it was soon realized that from a mathematical point of view, the two theories are equivalent. They give the same results. However, from a physical point of view, they are not equivalent, and this was the subject of quite intense debate at the time. In particular, in the Schrödinger picture, we have the wave function that is absent from the Heisenberg picture. And I'm mostly going to discuss not only the spectrum, but also the behavior of the wave function. So now another jump in time. We are in 1950, and the physicist Eugene Wigner was trying. So he was interested in describing the spectrum of the nuclei of very heavy atoms. And if you look at the Schrödinger operator that arises in that case, or the operators that you have to diagonalize, it is so complicated that you very rapidly lose hope of being able to do anything. So he made another postulate that for heavy nuclei, the spectrum should look more or less like the spectrum of a randomly chosen matrix, a large n by n matrix that you pick randomly in a certain ensemble that is called the Gaussian orthogonal ensemble. And so it was a postulate, but he was lucky because it seems to fit quite well the experimental data. So here on the left, you have a histogram that represents the spacing between consecutive eigenvalues for the spectrum of heavy nuclei as measured in nature. So this histogram is a statistical experiment, and the smooth curve here is the distribution predicted by the Wigner model. Here, this curve here, the Poisson curve, is just here to show that it doesn't look at all like a Poisson process. And this is another statistics that shows that Wigner prediction seems to fit quite well with the experiments. Now, in the 80s, people started to do numerical simulations more easily, and they discovered something that can be considered to be surprising, namely the fact that the Wigner model seems to fit quite well with a class of systems that are not at all high dimensional, that are very low dimensional. For instance, here, this is a numerical simulation. This is not a natural experiment. It's the hydrogen atom in a very strong magnetic field. And again, we have a histogram that measures the distribution of spacings between consecutive eigenvalues, and it fits rather well the Wigner prediction. And this is somehow surprising because the Wigner prediction was for systems with a very large number of degrees of freedom, whereas this one has a low number of degrees of freedom. People also started to investigate the spectrum of billiards. So what is a billiard in classical mechanics is just it's a plane domain with any shape that you like, a rectangle or a circle or any mathematical shape that you would like to imagine. So the particle moves on the billiard table. It is subject to no force, so it moves in straight line. But when it hits the boundary, it gets reflected. So here we have a classical dynamical system that is called billiard flow in mathematics, which is just, so away from reflection, we see that the momentum is preserved and the position of the particle moves in straight line. If we want to talk about the billiard from the point of view of quantum mechanics, we should replace this Newtonian description by the Schrödinger equation. And here, in the Schrödinger equation, because we have no force, the potential is zero. We just have the Laplacian corresponding to kinetic energy. But because there is a boundary, we should put a boundary condition. For instance, Dirichlet boundary condition. So in mathematics, when we talk about a billiard from a quantum point of view, we just mean that we study this equation. So this is the unitary equation generated by the Laplacian on a domain. And here are some numerical simulations from the 80s. So we see that the result depends a lot on the geometry of the billiard table. On the left, this is the case of a circular billiard. And here we see that the spacings between consecutive eigenvalues doesn't look like the Wigner model. It looks more like a Poisson process. In the middle, it's a billiard table that has been studied a lot by mathematicians. It's called the stadium billiard or the Bunimovich billiard. It has the shape of a rectangle and two half circles. And for this one, the statistics of eigenvalues resembles quite well the Wigner model. And the last one is a small modification of the stadium. You just modify slightly the boundary, and you get some different statistics that is not very well identified. So people made many experiments on different shapes of billiards, and what they realized experimentally is that for billiards that are ergodic, or maybe chaotic is the right word, for billiards that are chaotic, the spectrum, so here it's just the spectrum of the Laplacian with the Dirichlet, let's say Dirichlet boundary condition. So the spectrum of the Laplacian looks a little like the spectrum of a random matrix. And ergodicity here, again, what it means is that if you pick a random initial condition, so you take a random initial position and a random velocity, and you launch your billiard ball and follow it for a large time, then and you average any physical quantity over a large time, it will converge to the phase space average of this physical quantity. So we are led to formulate the main conjectures of the subject. The first conjecture is, so it's, in some sense, it would be maybe an answer to Einstein's original question. It seems that if you start from a classical system that is ergodic, or maybe you should assume some stronger chaotic properties, the spectrum, from the quantum point of view, should look like the spectrum of a large randomly chosen matrix. And here, randomly chosen means that you take a random symmetric matrix with Gaussian entries. And this is called the Bohigas-Giannoni-Schmidt conjecture. It was made by physicists. From a mathematical point of view, there is absolutely nothing known. So I'm not going to say much more about this conjecture. I'm going to talk more about the wave function. Maybe surprisingly, there are more things known about the wave functions than about the spectrum. So let's take a solution of the Schrödinger equation. Let's assume that the classical dynamics is chaotic, and we take a solution either evolved at a very large time, or we take an eigenfunction of, so we take a stationary solution, an eigenfunction of the Schrödinger operator, psi. And from the Max Born interpretation of quantum mechanics, when you take the modulus square of psi of x, it should give you the probability of finding the particle at the point x when you make an experiment. And people expect that if the classical system is chaotic, then this probability should be more or less uniform. You should find your particle with equal probability everywhere in the phase space. This is called the quantum unique ergodicity conjecture, that I'm going to discuss it a lot in the talk. And the last conjecture is called the Berry conjecture. It was formulated by Michael Berry, a British mathematician, a British physicist, sorry. And it says that, again, under the assumption that the classical system is chaotic, if you take a wave function, for instance, a stationary solution of the Schrödinger equation, and you look at it on a ball on a small ball whose radius is several times the wavelength, then what you see should look like a Gaussian random process. So if you want a random Gaussian superposition of plane waves. For mathematicians, this is a big vague formulation. So already a question is already to find a good rigorous mathematical formulation of the question. And this is also mostly open, although at the moment there is a lot of activity on the subject. And to be more precise, these three conjectures are meant to hold in what is called the semi-classical limit. This is the limit where the Planck constant goes to 0, if you want. So for the founders of quantum mechanics, it was clear from the beginning that when you let formally the Planck constant go to 0, you should recover classical mechanics from quantum mechanics. And what it means to let the Planck constant go to 0, it means that you are considering the limit where the wavelength is very small. One way to see this is, for instance, consider a stationary solution of the Schrödinger equation, so an eigenfunction of the Schrödinger equation. Then you see that the gradient of psi is of order square root of 2me over h. So saying that the Planck constant goes to 0 means that you consider waves that oscillate very rapidly, and the wavelength is of order h. So all these conjectures, to be rigorous, should be formulated asymptotically in the semi-classical limit. So now in this second part, I'm going little by little to go away from the physical presentation and to adopt a more mathematical point of view. And I will discuss the second conjecture that is called quantum erodicity. So I have a billiard table, so a domain in the plane. Or more generally, one might want to consider a Riemannian manifold, so a space that is curved and of arbitrary dimension. And in all cases, so if I consider a billiard, I want only to talk about a bounded billiard. And if I consider a Riemannian manifold, I want it to be compact, so I want it to be bounded. As we saw earlier, in classical mechanics, the billiard is described by the billiard flow, so motion in straight line and conservation of the momentum plus reflection on the boundary. If we are on a curved space, on a Riemannian manifold, what replaces this is the motion with zero acceleration, because we are considering a particle that moves without any force, so it should have zero acceleration, and this means that it should follow geodesics of the manifold. From the quantum point of view, we already saw that what replaces the Newtonian description is the Schrödinger equation, where there is no potential because there is no force. We just have the Laplacian. So if we are on a billiard table, we have some boundary condition. If we are on a Riemannian manifold, we have to consider the Laplace-Beltrami operator. Oops. And I will be mostly interested in time-independent solutions, so eigenfunctions of the Laplacian. And you see here that, so when we talk about, I will mostly, for a billiard or for a Riemannian manifold, I will be mostly interested in the spectrum of the Laplacian and the eigenfunctions of the Laplacian. A lot of what I'm going to say could be adapted to the case when there is a force, but from a mathematical point of view, it's already sufficient to look at the case without force because it already encapsulates all the difficulties. And I'm going to show some pictures so that you can form your own idea of what is interesting to look at. So here is a billiard in the shape of a disc. So in red, you can see a few billiard trajectories. And in green, you can see a few eigenfunctions of the Laplacian. The places where the color is dark green is the places where the wave has a large amplitude. And where it's white or almost white, it means that the wave has a very small amplitude. If you prefer manifolds, here is a sphere. So here the eigenfunctions of the Laplacian are called spherical harmonics. So all these eigenfunctions here correspond to the same energy, but they have different rotational symmetries. And here is a billiard in the shape of a square. So here the eigenfunctions of the Laplacian are just sinus nx, sinus my. And I think you will agree with me that in all these pictures, the pictures are not extremely exciting. Actually, these three examples are precisely completely integrable systems. So completely integrable means that there are many symmetries. And these many symmetries imply that if you choose the right coordinates, you can compute everything. You can compute exactly the trajectories of the billiard. You can compute the spectrum of the Laplacian. So you have formulas to work with. This is more or less what completely integrable means, is that you have explicit formulas. It's not, and I'm not going to talk about this kind of billiards. On the opposite, I'm going to talk about billiards for which you have absolutely no formula. So if you want to understand what happens, either you do numerical simulations or you prove theorems. Actually, it's not very fair to say that completely integrable systems are not interesting. But anyway, I have many colleagues working on them, and they do interesting things, but they are not going to be the subject of this talk. So for instance, this is the stadium billiard that we already see. I show this old numerical simulation because it was one of the first in the subject. It's done by the chemist Eric Heller. So here are eight consecutive eigenfunctions of the Laplacian. And so in dark colors, again, are the places where the amplitude of the wave is very large. And in white are the places where the amplitude is small. Here is a more modern picture. So now it is 28, I think, 28 consecutive eigenfunctions of the Laplacian. And you can see that depending on the frequency, you see very different patterns. I have some colleagues who do numerics on other shapes of billiards. For instance, this is a mushroom-shaped billiard, or just half of the billiard. Again, depending on the frequency, you see very different patterns. And of course, it's also interesting to do numerics on the time evolution. So the time-dependent equation, these are a few snapshots of a movie of how a Gaussian wave packet evolves in a billiard of the shape of a cardioid, or just half the cardioid. So you start with a Gaussian wave packet in this strange billiard, and you let it evolve according to the Schrödinger equation. So at some point, so it moves more or less in straight line. At some point, it hits the boundary and gets reflected. But after each reflection, there are some deformation taking place and some interferences occurring. And if you wait for a very long time, after some time, it stabilizes and becomes like this. And we would like to say that this is a very disordered wave, and that this disorder comes from the chaotic property of the billiard, of the classical billiard. Today, I'm not going to say much about the time-dependent equation. This is mostly for lack of time. There are many results about it. So what are we going to study precisely? So now I completely forget about the physical notation. Instead of writing h bar over 2m, I just write that I'm considering the eigenfunctions of the Laplacian. Because I am in a bounded space, I have a discrete spectrum. The eigenvalues are lambda k, and they form a discrete sequence going to infinity. And I'm going always to normalize the eigenfunctions to have, so the integral of the square is equal to 1. And I will be mostly interested in the probability density for each eigenfunction. I have the probability density modulus of psi k of h squared. And I want to know how these probability densities occupy the space. If they are localized in a very small portion of space, or if they are delocalized everywhere. And the semi-classical limit, h bar goes to 0, corresponds to lambda k goes to infinity. This is one of the main theorems of the subject. It's called quantum ergodicity theorem, or Schnirelmann theorem, and it was proved in the 80s. In this theorem, we are assuming, again, ergodicity. Ergodicity of the geodesic flow or of the billiard flow. And we want to say that this ergodicity property implies that the probability measure psi k square is close to the uniform measure. So it's close to occupying uniformly the space. The way it is phrased is as follows. We take any observable, so a function a, on the space, and we want to compare the average of a with respect to the probability psi k square, and the average of A with respect to the uniform probability measure. And the statement of the Schnirelmann theorem is the following. So you take the difference between these two quantities, you take the absolute value, and now you average over all the spectrum less than lambda. So here n of lambda is just the number of terms in the sum. So you average over all frequencies less than lambda, and the statement of the theorem is that when the frequency goes to infinity, this quantity goes to 0. I think we should take some time to try to understand what it means. So first, maybe I should say that if I don't put any absolute value here, if I just write this, this is always true. This is true without any chaotic assumption. And this is just saying that I'm computing the trace of an operator in two different ways. So it's very important to have this absolute value. And so we have an average of positive quantities, and this average is becoming small when the frequency goes to infinity. This has to imply that most of the terms here are small. So maybe a better way, a completely equivalent way of phrasing the Schneermann theorem is to say that you can find a subset of the eigenfrequencies, not the full subset, but the subset of full density, of density 1, so that the average of A for the state psi of h squared approaches the uniform average. In other terms, so in mathematics, this is called the weak topology. This probability measure is close to being uniform, but this is not necessarily true for all eigenstates, but for a subset of density 1 of them. And maybe a better way of seeing this is in this picture. If we see this picture, we see, and if we can do simulations for higher and higher frequency, and we will see that for most of the eigenstates, we see a shade that is close to uniform. This means that the wave occupies more and more uniformly the space the phase space. However, we always see, and this is an experimental remark, we always see a few waves that have a completely different behavior. They are not uniform. What the theorem says is that maybe this exists, but these are very few. Most of them are uniform. So maybe I'll also discuss a more technical but more complete statement of the theorem. In the previous statement, I was only discussing observables A that were functions of the position, but the theorem is actually stronger than that. It's actually about observables A that are functions of position and momentum. So A is now a function on phase space, on classical phase space. It's a function of the position x and of the momentum psi. And since I think a lot of you have studied physics, you have probably seen that if you have a classical observable, from this you can build a quantum observable, so you can build an operator by replacing the momentum by 1 over I d over dx. Usually you put an h bar here, but I'm going to consider only functions that are very nice, and in particular that depend only on the direction of the momentum. So, okay. So we have a classical observable A. We build a quantum observable from it by the usual rules. And now we are interested in the bracket, the matrix element between psi k, A psi k. So this is the average of A in the state psi k. And the general statement of the theorem is as follows. So it reinforces the previous one. It now says that for most, so it's always under the ergodicity property. It says that for almost all the eigenfunctions, and if you work in the large frequency limit, the average of the observable A in the state psi k approaches the average of A with respect to the microcanonical average. So this is uniform in position and in momentum. So there is not only equidistribution in position, but also in momentum. And these are more examples of billiards for which it is known that the classical dynamics is chaotic. This is called a Sinai billiard, again the stadium billiard and the cardioid billiard. So again, ergodicity means that if I take an initial condition at random and if I launch my particle for a long time, and if I average any physical quantity I like, the time average approaches the phase space average. And for all these billiards, we know that the theorem holds. Something that the theorem doesn't say, so as I mentioned earlier, when we do numerical simulation on this example, we see experimentally that for arbitrarily large frequencies, we see some eigenfunctions that are absolutely not uniformly distributed. What the theorem says is that these eigenfunctions, if they exist, are very scarce, but it doesn't say when they exist and when they do not. For the stadium billiard, maybe this is surprising because this is a very simple geometry, but it's impossible to compute anything by hand. So it's not possible to compute the trajectories of the billiard by hand, and it's not possible to have a formula for the wave propagation. Okay, so it's such, although the geometry looks very simple, the dynamics of the billiard is actually very complicated, and people struggle for many years to try to prove rigorously that there exists, that these eigenfunctions that are not uniformly distributed exist, and it was done 10 years ago by Andrew Hassel, an Australian mathematician. An outcome to one of the big conjectures of the subject is called quantum unique ergodicity. It was formulated by Rudnick and Sarnak in '94. And they conjecture that now, the conjecture holds for a curved manifold, a manifold that has a negative curvature. This is known, it's known that negative curvature implies some very strong chaotic property of the classical dynamics. What they conjecture is that for this kind of geometry, the eigenstates of the Laplacian become uniform for all frequencies without having this scarce subsequence that has a different behavior. So that really their conjecture is that for negatively curved manifold, you don't see this kind of phenomenon. Actually, Rudnick and Sarnak, they are people working in number theory, and their motivation came mostly not from physics and not from PDE, but from a certain class of negatively curved manifolds that are called arithmetic manifolds. And for these manifolds, it's known that these physical quantities can be reinterpreted as they are related to certain values of L functions that arise in analytic number theory. So their motivation, I mean, they knew about the physical motivations, but their work mostly implied number theory, and their motivation to believe this came from number theory. And in the particular setting of arithmetic manifolds, so the very specific setting where you can use number theory, the conjecture was proved by Elon Lindenstrauss, who got the Fields Medal in, I think, 8 years ago, I don't remember, and also some contribution by Kannan Soundararajan. So the conjecture is proved, but in a very special case that has no relation to physics, where you can reconvert these quantities into certain objects that are studied in number theory. In full generality, the conjecture is open, but there are some partial results. So here are the results. And this is the one that was mentioned in the prize citation. So I consider a negatively curved manifold. It can have any dimension. And I'm interested in, again, in the bracket of an observable A in an eigenstate psi k. And by some general abstract mathematical consideration, this, in the large frequency limit, has to converge to something which is the average of A with respect to some unknown probability measure. The quantum ergodicity conjecture is to show that this unknown probability measure is the microcanonical ensemble, so the uniform probability on the phase space. But abstractly, we just know that there is such an unknown probability measure. And what I did, partly on my own and partly with Stefan Nonnenmacher, is to prove that this probability measure, mu, cannot be localized in a small part of phase space. And I measured this by a quantity that is called entropy. So it is a quantity introduced by Kolmogorov and Sinai in dynamical systems. It is So it is a variant of the entropy used in information theory, and it encodes the degree of complexity of an invariant measure of a dynamical system. What I managed to prove is that the unknown probability measure here must have some positive, meaning non-vanishing entropy, and the fact that it has non-vanishing entropy implies that it cannot be localized in a too small portion of the phase space. For instance, so I'm not going to give the rigorous definition of this entropy. I'm just going to give an example of a consequence of the theorem. For instance, if M is a manifold of constant negative curvature, the result implies that the probability measure mu needs to be supported on a set of large enough dimensions. So it cannot be supported in a set that is small in the sense that it has a small dimension. And in fact, the support of the measure mu needs to have dimension at least D, which is the dimension. So D is not the dimension of the full phase space, it's the dimension of the configuration space. So if the quantum ergodicity conjecture was true, so if mu was the microcanonical ensemble, this should be 2D here. We were only able to prove D, but already this was a new result. In particular, it implies that it's not possible to make a sequence of eigenstates that concentrates to a single closed geodesics, for instance. So it's a delocalization result in the sense that it says that eigenfunctions of the Schrödinger operator in the large frequency limit, they cannot concentrate in a too small part of the space. And last year, there was a new result by Dyatlov and Jin. So this result is, for the moment, it only holds in dimension 2, so for surfaces and in constant negative curvature. It says, it adds some more information. It says that the unknown probability measure mu must put a positive mass everywhere in the space. So it is not possible for mu to be 0 on a certain open subset of the phase space. So it's not possible to make a solution of the Schrödinger equation that does not visit an open subset of the manifold. So the two results are somehow complementary. It says that if you take a solution, and the result is also true for the time-dependent Schrödinger equation. On a negatively curved manifold, it's not possible to have a solution that stays away from an open subset, and it's not possible that it stays in the vicinity on a set of too small dimensions. This one is greater than or equal to.
Torus, the integral of torus would have had.
Yeah, it turns out, so the torus is a kind of intermediate situation. If you consider the sphere, which is completely integrable but very degenerate, this result is false because you can make sequences of spherical harmonics that concentrate on an equator. So you would have one here. For the torus, this result is also true, but for completely different reasons. And it's obvious if you consider the exponential functions as eigenfunctions, but if you make more complicated combinations, it's also true, but it's less obvious too. Yes. So D is the dimension of if the system is completely integrable, this would be the dimension of the Km tori. And for chaotic, we would expect 2D, but for the moment, nobody knows how to prove it.
So you can't rule out.
No.
I have a question, actually. Hi. So this eigenfunction psi k is any typical eigenfunction, or k is just some fixed thing?
No, I'm considering the semi-classical limit, so lambda k goes to infinity.
Oh, I see. Okay.
So when I say that the solution cannot vanish on an open set, it's not for a fixed k, it's asymptotically in the limit of large frequency. So So now I want to dedicate the last part of the talk to certain toy models that many people studied and that I've been interested in the last years. So what a toy model is supposed to be a model that is simpler than the one that you were studying. And simpler means either that you can do some explicit calculation by hands or that the numerical calculations are easier. And in the physics, in mathematical physics literature, many toy models have been considered to study the three conjectures that I've mentioned in the introduction. I don't have time to mention all the toy models, but all of them have a discrete character. That means that in these toy models, instead of studying the limit where the Planck constant goes to 0, what people do is to consider a Schrödinger equation on a finite dimensional Hilbert space of dimension n, and the dimension n goes to infinity. And this somehow replaces the fact that the Planck constant goes to 0. In this talk, I'm only going to talk about one toy model, which is the case of regular graphs. So a graph is a set of vertices, and these vertices are related by edges. And regular means that all vertices have the same number of edges. So here, for instance, each vertex has three neighbors. This is a very particular and very symmetric model, but still there are interesting things to do. So I have a regular graph. So more generally, each vertex has q plus 1 neighbors. And I will be interested in a discrete Schrödinger operator, which is the discrete Laplacian. Again, no potential for the moment. And if you have a function on the vertices of the graph, the way you define the Laplacian is as follows. So the Laplacian of f at a vertex x is the sum over all the vertices neighbors to x of f of y minus f of x. If the graph is regular, so if all points have q plus 1 neighbors, this is the same as doing the sum over all neighbors of f of y minus q plus 1 as f of x. So for this particular geometric setting, the Laplacian is the same as the adjacency matrix minus a multiple of identity. So somehow I prefer to talk about the adjacency matrix of the graph rather than the Laplacian, but this is the same object. Maybe we should, actually, so this model has been considered in a few physics papers, and it's considered by everybody to be a good model, or a good toy model for quantum chaos. And in fact, as soon as you start working on this model, it is quite addictive, and you don't really wonder why you want to study it, but maybe it's good to find a few motivations why it is somehow a good model for the questions we addressed before. So we are going to study graphs that locally look like a tree. So locally, they will look like like a tree of valency q plus 1. And this is a bit similar to the fact that manifold of constant negative curvature look locally like a hyperbolic space. In terms of curvature, one can define the curvature of a tree, and in fact, everybody agrees that it has curvature minus infinity. So it's not only negative, but it is minus infinity. If you want to use tools from harmonic analysis, the harmonic analysis on the regular tree is very similar to the harmonic analysis on hyperbolic spaces. And there are also colleagues who study quantum chaos using representation theory. For instance, if they want to study surfaces of constant negative curvature, they want to use the fact that it is the symmetric space associated to the Lie group SL2 of R. Well, if Q is a prime number, this image remains true, that the P plus 1 regular tree can be seen as the symmetric space associated with the Lie group SL2 of QP. So there are some similarities that make one think that maybe it is relevant to study this toy model. There is one big difference, is that I will be fixing the number of neighbors. So the spectrum, so I'm considering only bounded operators. The spectrum of the adjacency matrix is always bounded between minus q plus 1 and q plus 1, and q is fixed. So I'm not going to study the limit of large frequencies. But as I said, in this kind of question, what replaces the semi-classical limit is to look at a finite graph with n vertices, but the limit when n goes to infinity. And some advantages of the model. The first advantage is that the adjacency matrix of a graph of n vertices is an n by n matrix. So if you want to test the validity of the Wigner model, for instance, it might be simple than to do it. It might be simpler than to do it for a continuous model. And another advantage is that regular graphs, or more generally graphs, may be easily randomized. So you can construct a random graph. Basically, for instance, one way to construct a random regular graph is to pick. So you pick endpoints, and then you attach edges in all possible ways that would make the graph regular. And so there are many ways. So you have to be able to count how many ways to do that. But some people know how to do that. This is a combinatorics. And you count all the possible ways, and you put the uniform probability measure. So this gives a meaning to picking a graph at random. And if you do that, then the adjacency matrix becomes a random matrix. And so it might become easier to compare it with the Wigner model. One advantage also of considering random geometry is that you might want to prove results that are not true for all graphs, but only for graphs with a large probability. I will always make a geometric assumption. So we have a sequence of graphs that becomes bigger and bigger, but we have to say somehow in what way they become bigger and bigger, because there are many different sequences of graphs that can come to your mind. And we will always assume that our graph doesn't have many short loops. This means that if I look at a typical point in my graph and I look at the neighborhood of this point, I see a tree. And this is already known this is called the Keston-McKay law. This is known to imply the convergence of the empirical spectral measures. So what it means is that if you pick any interval I and you count the number of eigenvalues lambda I in this interval and divide by n, this is known to have a limit. So there is a limiting density that you can compute. There is a formula for it. I didn't write it, but you can compute the limiting density, and it looks like that. So this is a numerical simulation. So on the left, it is for a graph that has 2,000 vertices, and each point has 3 neighbors. And the histogram here is just correspond to the empirical density of eigenvalues. So the red one is the empirical one, and there is a smooth curve here, which is the theoretical density that appears here. And this is the same experiment, but now for a graph for which each point has 5 neighbors. And for computational reasons, you have to lower the number of vertices, so it's only 500. But again, you can see that the histogram approaches a limiting curve that can be computed explicitly. And this is a theorem I proved with my former student Etienne Lemasson in 2013. Our goal was first to see if there was an analog of the phenomenon of quantum ergodicity, but for large graphs. So we make 2 assumptions. The first one is the fact that there are few short loops. So the typical neighborhood of a point looks like a tree. And second one is that our graphs should form an expander family. In other words, the rate of mixing of, so this expander assumption replaces the ergodicity assumption. it means that the random walk on the graph mixes fast enough. So now we are interested in the eigenfunctions of the discrete Laplacian on the graph. So we take an orthonormal basis of eigenfunctions. And we want, so now if we have an eigenfunction, so it's a function on the vertices. If we take phi I of h squared, now it is a probability measure on the vertices. So we have a large graph, we take an eigenfunction of the Laplacian, and we get, by taking the square, we get a probability measure on the vertices. We want to know if this probability measure occupies uniformly the graph or if it is localized in a very small part of the graph. To test this, we take one observable, so a function A on the vertices, and we compare the average of this observable with respect to phi I of h squared. We want to compare it with the uniform average. And the result that we can prove is that if we, so again, it's very important, if we don't put the eigenvalue here, the result is true, but it's trivial, so it's important here to, if we take the absolute value of the difference, and if we average over the spectrum, then this limit, this quantity goes to 0 in the semi-classical limit. So again, as before, we have this feature that we can only prove things on average over the spectrum. But this is an average of positive quantities. So if it is small, it means that most of these quantities must be small. So as previously, one can rephrase the theorem in a completely equivalent way. We are given any positive epsilon, so any error that you allow yourself. Then the number of eigenstates for which the probability measure phi I of h squared is far away from epsilon from the uniform average, the number of such eigenstates is relatively small compared to n. So again, it says that I take a large graph satisfying my geometric assumptions. I take an eigenfunction of the Laplacian on it. Then for most of the eigenfunctions, I'm going to have a uniform distribution on the vertices. But this is only for most of them, because the theorem doesn't rule out that there could be a scarce number of eigenfunctions that are localized. This is what we would like to show, but we are not able to. This is another result. It is by Brutz and Lindenstrauss. It is a bit similar, but I'll discuss the differences. First, the geometric assumptions are different. They don't use any expansion condition, but they need to assume something more quantitative on the number of short loops. There must be few loops of length log n. And then the result says the following. If I have an eigenfunction of the Laplacian, if I have a subset of the vertices for which the eigenfunction phi puts a large measure, then this subset cannot be too small. The size of the subset must be at least some power of n. So it is very similar to the result I stated earlier about the entropy. It says that it's not possible for the eigenfunctions to be localized in a set that is too small, in the sense that the set is smaller than some power of n. So if you want to compare the two results, they are quite different. This one has the advantage that it says something about all the eigenfunctions that can never be concentrated in a too small part of the graph. On the other hand, it doesn't say that the probability distribution is close to be uniform. It just says that it cannot be carried by a set that is too small. I'll soon be done. I want to stress the fact that these two results, this one and this one, they are deterministic results. They are about deterministic graphs. So if you give me a graph, and if it satisfies this assumption that there are not too many loops, and that I have some knowledge of the spectral gap of the adjacency matrix, I can tell you that it satisfies these two results. So in particular, this result applies to some well-known families of graphs that have a reason in number theory or in group theory. If you are interested in random graphs, it means that you are ready to accept results that are not true for all graphs, but only true for a large proportion of graphs. Then you can go much further, and this is the contents of some recent result by people around H.T. Yao. So for instance, they were able to show that if you pick a regular graph at random, so here there is this technical issue that the degree, so Q is not fixed but should grow mildly with n, but maybe they will be able to remove it, I don't know. So if you pick a graph at random and you measure the statistics of the spacings between eigenvalues, they can show that it fits with the Wigner prediction. So they can show not for all graphs, but for almost all the graphs. Again, they are also able to show, maybe I will just comment the last line. They are able to show, so this is Bauer, Schmidt, Wang, and Yao, and now the degree of the graph is fixed, but a bit unfortunately, it is fixed but very large. Hopefully they will be able to reduce it to a much. So the rigorous proof only works for degree fixed but extremely large. But I think people believe that it's also true for graphs of valency 3, but there is no proof of that. So you pick a graph at random, then most of the time you see that all the eigenfunctions are uniformly distributed. So this is what they call, they say that it is an analog of quantum unique periodicity, because this result here is true for all the eigenfunctions. So for all of them, the probability measure phi I of h square is uniform, is close to uniform on the vertices. So this is true for all eigenfunctions, but almost all graphs. Whereas my result was true for all graphs, but almost all eigenfunctions. And finally, also very recently, kind of analog of the Berry conjecture was proved by two people from Hungary, Backhaus and Szegedi. Actually, they had no notion of this Berry conjecture. They didn't know anything about quantum chaos. They were more interested into combinatorics and group theory. So remember this Berry conjecture, maybe you shouldn't read the precise statement because it is a bit technical, but the Berry conjecture is that if your system is chaotic, you take a solution of the Schrödinger equation and you look at it on a ball of radius several times the wavelengths, then you see something that looks like a random superposition of plane waves. They can prove this for a graph picked at random. So if you pick a graph at random and you look at any eigenfunction and the restriction of this eigenfunction to a ball, then it looks like a Gaussian process in some sense. There's some open questions and suggestions for development. So of course, we would like to prove some version of quantum unique periodicity for deterministic graph and not only random graphs. I would like to mention that in the last 2 or 3 years with Mostafa Sabri, we have started working on on models that are a bit more relevant to physicists. So usually physicists, they like to work with discrete Schrödinger operator, but they want a potential. In particular, there is this Anderson model where you consider the discrete Laplacian, but you add a random potential. So what we were able to show is that if you take a small perturbation of a regular graph, so either we take a regular graph but add some random potential on it, or you add some random conductances. So if you do you add some small disorder of a regular graph, then our result of delocalization still holds. So we still have a version of this result, that most of the eigenfunctions are uniformly spread of the vertices. Yeah, and this work on graphs has also raised the question of maybe trying to study random manifolds. So I think the recent work on random graphs has pointed the fact that if you are not able to show something for all geometries, maybe you should just try to pick a geometry at random and say that almost all the time your result will be true. And in particular, I'm currently very interested in trying to show some of these conjectures for random manifolds. And Mariam Mirzakhani, in particular, has found many formulas that allows to study random hyperbolic surfaces. So I'm hoping to hit some of her formulas and maybe make progress in that direction. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for that very illuminating talk that went from hydrogen atom to latest developments. I think she'll take questions, so please.
Okay. The last part of your talk reminds me of the work in random matrix theory in, let's say, in 1, 2, and higher dimensions. And if you take a random matrix theory partition function and expand it in terms of Feynman diagrams, maybe you know what that is. Yes. Then you can get all these random graphs actually, and if you go to higher and higher vertices, they become more and more dense. So there must be some deep connection between the results you're showing and whether they can be derived in terms of the techniques one knows in random matrix theory.
Yeah, I don't know if, I'm not able to say if these partition functions and generating series can be used to say something about the eigenfunctions and the graphs. I'm not able to say, but
what I meant is that partition function is just one observable you can work with, but certainly there is there are operators you can introduce in these models also, which are like Hamiltonians or discrete Laplacians, etc. Actually, so.
Question there. First over there. Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, is there a heuristic for why in the flat case when there's for the plane domains that you get only the convergence happens only for density 1, but then the negatively curved you expect it to hold for the whole sequence?
So for the stadium billiard, as I said, it was proven, but after a lot of efforts, that there is a subsequence that is not equidistributed. And in fact, this subsequence, if you look at it, it really behaves as if the billiard was just a rectangle, and it doesn't really see the aisle of the stadium. So there are these bouncing ball modes. So there are billiard trajectories that bounce back and forth between these two sides. And these waves behave a bit like that. They also bounce back and forth. From the point of view of classical mechanics, these are trajectories that have zero Lyapunov exponents. Mm-hmm. So they are unstable, but they are only unstable in a polynomial way and not exponential. And somehow, and this kind of classical trajectories do not exist for negatively curved manifold. There are positive Lyapunov exponents everywhere. So this is a kind of heuristic explanation, but nobody was really able to make this explanation into a rigorous proof. But the big difference between this dynamical system and the negative curvature ones is really the existence here of trajectories with zero Lyapunov exponents.
I have 1 minute, I think.
No, I just has a small question. Yeah, this is when you have the assumption about few short loops. I was just wondering, how do you quantify few? Is it related to arithmeticity or non-arithmeticity?
So few. If I'm given any number, let's say 1,000, and I want to count the number of loops of length less than 1,000, then the number of such loops will be negligible compared to n, the size of the graph. And so if you make it into the more quantity, so and actually, let's see. So here you have this limit that is 0. Actually, this is you can make it quantitative. And the rate at which it will converge to 0 can be made explicit in terms of the number of short loops and of the spectral gap of the adjacency matrix. So if I tell you precisely how many loops of size 1,000 there are, or less than 1,000 there are, and if this number is relatively small compared to n, I can tell you, I mean, I could look at the paper and tell you precisely how it will contribute to the error.
Thank you.
And the loops are bad. So what is difficult in all this, I showed the picture of the snapshot of the movie of a wave packet that evolves in a billiard. So you see that after some time it comes back to where it started, and it starts dispersing, and there are interferences. And most of the time, for mathematicians, it's impossible to describe these interferences precisely. You can just say that these interferences are the sum of all the contributions that come from all the bounces on the walls, but this is a sum of many terms, and you don't know if they will. It's impossible to say if they will add up constructively or destructively. And for graphs, also the loops will, if the wave, so if there is a short loop, then the wave will be able to come back very easily, and you will have interferences, and they are very difficult to control. So the reason why we need to avoid short loops is precisely because we don't know how to control these interferences.
Some control, yeah. Thanks.
Can I? So heuristically, I think you explain why you need negative curvature and what is, but can you explain that?
So negative curvature implies that all the classical trajectories are very unstable. So they have positive non-zero Lyapunov exponents. So it means if you perturb a little the initial condition, there will be very rapid divergence of the nearby trajectories. So it means also that if you start with a Gaussian wave packet, it has typically the size is a square root of h, and you let it evolve according to the Schrödinger equation, then it will spread around very rapidly already due to the fact that the classical dynamics has this instability, and from the point of view of quantum mechanics, the wave packets will spread around. So heuristically, you would like to say that it's very difficult to make a localized stationary state because of that. But nobody has really been able to make this intuitive argument into a rigorous proof.
In terms of the random graphs, you got a term called n star. What does n star mean? And
n star. So in the random case, no, it's just so. For instance, so yeah, I didn't describe this result. So if the eigenfunction is completely uniform, it means that phi I of x squared is equal to 1 over n. So phi I of x is equal to 1 over square root of n. But you cannot really prove to prove exactly that, because this would be really very strong. So what they prove is almost as good as that. They prove that phi I of x is 1 over square root of n times log n to some power that I didn't want to. It's not on maybe 123 or so. They have a logarithmic correction in that result, and I think they cannot really hope to get rid of it. So it's almost the best that you can hope for, in the sense that it's 1 over square root of n, but there is this logarithmic term, so log of n to the power something. So this just means that I didn't want to write the precise exponents, because it's certainly not optimal.
So you got the log star term very analytically, as in through a lot of calculation you got log n star term, and there's no sort of like algebraic background behind like why you have.
There is some power of the log that comes up in the proof, and I think if you consider the Wigner random matrices, so symmetric matrices where you put Gaussian entries, already for this model there is a log that comes, so you cannot really hope to completely get rid of this log. Maybe what you can hope is to improve the power here, but I don't think you really want to do that.
So I had a couple of questions. So in the graph context, what would be the analog of integrable sort of graph? Is it just a sort of a regular tree for this Brouhard-Titz tree, or is there some set of graphs which have Poisson statistics rather than?
I would say maybe just discrete tori. Mm-hmm. Just you take a grid, a finite square grid, and you.
Okay, but is there a characterization of what kind of graphs would be?
Not really.
So, and the second question was sort of related, but going back to the like in the billiards, you had these special eigenfunctions which were local. So you said they are to do with the zero-Lyapunov index, but in general, in physics, there is this thing called the Gutzwiller trace formula, which expresses the semi-classical propagator in terms of closed geodesics. So somehow all the other geodesics don't really contribute in that to at least a leading order, and it's only the closed geodesics that contribute. I was wondering how to connect that intuition with somehow here it's.
So I think so. There is this big discussion. So you see that. So the quantum ergodicity theorem says that most of these states, when you go to the high frequency limit, the probability is close to uniform, which means that if you integrate
they cancel out
any observable, then you get something which is close to the microcanonical average. But this doesn't rule out the fact that you can discuss some finer details. So, for instance, this one here, this eigenfunction seems to be enhanced along a certain closed orbit, or
this one, I guess, one.
This one. So some of them have.
Here, yeah.
But this is a very fine detail, so you don't see it when you average a macroscopic observable. You would see it maybe if you were able to average a very microscopic observable. So there is this kind of patterns were called scars by Eric Heller, and there is a big discussion about how they should be defined rigorously, and if they really exist. I think for physicists, there is no precise definition. It is just something that you see on the picture. But there is no, and for mathematicians, the only good definition that we have is this definition of average, of making a macroscopic average. And we can show that if we do macroscopic averages, then you don't see them because they will. But I remember that Eric Heller had this similar interpretation that because of the trace formula, still these scars should exist, but I think we are still lacking a good enough definition of what it means. It's just something that you see visually, but it's difficult to to make it rigorous, to make a precise definition.
So you made this comment that for physicists these things are just pictures, but I just wanted to point out that there is a enormous amount of interest today in physics in systems of quantum mechanics of real fermions, which are disordered actually. It's called the SYK model, Sachdev E. Kitaev model. Now, in those models, I mean, the physicists actually compute explicitly what are called out-of-time order correlation functions, and establish that these are quantum chaotic systems, explicitly computing the exponents. I mean, so it's just not pictures. I mean, there's a lot of work actually that.
In fact, this is something I'm trying to learn at the moment. So if you give me good references.
Okay, surely.
I give it as a subject to one of my master students just so that I'm forced to learn it.
Okay, all right.
But I'll be glad if you can give me some references that are good also for mathematicians.
Okay.
Probably more accessible mathematicians.
Cheers.
Okay, any further questions? If not, let's thank Prasanth and Raman again.